Good morning, everybody. Hey, if we haven't met yet, my name is Lucas, and I'm a youth minister here at Firehouse, and I'm so glad that you're tuning in today. Story time. Several years ago, my cousin and I took a road trip out west, and we eventually hit California, where we had reservations to camp at a state park. By the time that we got to that state park, we were both so sleep-deprived from traveling, and every little thing that one person would do would drive the other person insane. So we were super passive-aggressive and short-tempered toward each other. And then he tells me that to get to our campsite, we were gonna have to hike for a couple hours just up this huge hill, which I still refer to as a small mountain. And I was so exhausted from traveling. It was dark. You could hear coyotes howling from the direction of our campsite. There were probably mountain lions. So I told him, I am not hiking up there right now. You can go ahead and get yourself eaten by wildlife, and I'll sleep safely in the car for tonight. Long story short, this led to a huge fight. There was arguing and yelling, and we said some not so nice words to each other. And no joke, I eventually ended up getting on a plane the next day and flying home, and it was only halfway through our trip. We were both so mad that we didn't speak to each other for nearly a year. True story. So, can you think of a time that you got into a fight with somebody close to you? Maybe it got to the point where it felt like a wall was being built between the two of you. Whether it's a friend, a family member, or even someone you barely know, relationships aren't always easy or happy. We fight, we compare, we compete, and sometimes we even stop talking to one another. And when we don't deal with these walls of separation, it can usually result in a relationship so divided and broken, and it may seem impossible to put it all back together. These walls that we build were actually a really big problem for the early followers of Jesus as well. We're picking up where we left off last week in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, where he knew that walls of separation could not exist if the church was going to survive. Last week, we learned that the Apostle Paul was one of the early leaders of the church. And remember that when we say the church, we're talking about a community of people trying to follow the ways of Jesus. We're not talking about a building or something that you do on Sunday mornings. The church is a who and not a what or a where. The church is God's family. So, before we read this passage from chapter 2, you should know that the early church was made up of two different groups of people, the Jews and the Gentiles. The Jews and Gentiles were not people you'd often find hanging out together. For generations, they'd had these big issues and differences that divided them. The Jews were known as God's chosen people, the people who told God's story and gave us the Old Testament of the Bible. And Gentiles is a word that literally means everyone who isn't a Jew. So if you weren't Jewish back then, you would have been considered a Gentile. When Jesus arrived and he started his ministry, he declared that everyone, Jew and Gentile, was invited into God's family. And then some Jews and some Gentiles finally started coming together as one body of believers. But because they had these huge disagreements going on for generations prior, getting along with one another wasn't exactly easy for them. So we're going to read this passage from Ephesians 2, but just to let you know, I want to read it to you from the version that we find from the Message Bible. The Message Bible isn't actually a word-for-word translation of the original text, but it's paraphrasing the Bible in words that are a little more up-to-date and easier for us to understand. So here we go. Paul is writing specifically to the Gentiles in this part, and he tells them, "It was only yesterday that you outsiders to God's ways, aka non-Jewish people, had no idea of any of this, didn't know the first thing about the way God works, hadn't the faintest idea of Christ. You knew nothing of that rich history of God's covenants and promises in Israel, hadn't a clue about what God was doing in the world at large. Now, because of Christ, dying that death, shedding that blood, you who were once out of it altogether are in on everything." Now, in this next part, Paul talks about that wall of separation between the Jews and Gentiles. He says, "The Messiah," which is another word that we use when referring to Jesus, "the Messiah has made things up between us so that we're now together on this, both non-Jewish outsiders and Jewish insiders. He tore down the wall we used to keep each other at a distance. Christ brought us together through his death on the cross. The cross got us to embrace, and that was the end of the hostility. Christ came and preached peace to you outsiders and peace to us insiders. He treated us as equals and so made us equals. Through him, we both share the same spirit and have equal access to the Father." So again, all of these passages were from the Message paraphrase of the Bible. So make sure that you go back later and read this chapter from a more accurate translation. When you do, you'll find that Paul is referring to two different walls here. The wall that separated the Jews from the Gentiles, and the wall that separates all of us from God. And that wall that separates all of us from God wasn't built by disagreements or misunderstandings. It was built by us and our sin and anything that we do that goes against God's purpose. What Paul tells us is that through Jesus, walls can be knocked down. When Jesus died that sacrificial death on the cross, he pulled down that wall that separated us from God and from each other, and he made a way for us to be reconciled and united. In the early church, the Jews and the Gentiles, they had really different traditions surrounding how they followed God. It was easy for them to get swept up in judging one another, disagreeing with one another, and being stubborn about their own views. Paul knew that walls of division would keep God's family from thriving. And the same is true today. So, going back to my story from earlier about the road trip that I took with my cousin, after months and months of not speaking to each other, we eventually were both at a family gathering. And then at one point he came up to me and he said, "Lucas, it's about time that we talk about California." And you know what happened? We talked through it. We each took turns giving our side of the story, and we listened to what the other person had to say. Don't get me wrong, this was not an easy conversation at all. We both had to be patient with one another and stay humble. And when we each said that we were sorry, we both had to forgive each other, for real. But he was the one who took that first step, that first of many steps toward us reconciling our differences. And now we still have a very positive relationship with one another to this very day. This story is a reminder for me, and maybe it is for you too, that we can do for others what God has done for us. Ask yourself, is there a wall in your life that needs to be torn down? Is it a wall between you and someone else? Is it a wall between you and God? This week, I want to challenge you to start tearing down a wall and start building bridges. Just how Jesus made the first move of reconciliation toward you and I, maybe there's someone in your life who needs you to make that first move. Or maybe you need to do some hard work to remove some obstacles or things that keep that wall between you and God. And in order to do this, how might you need to humble yourself, or ask for forgiveness, or give forgiveness? Just like Jesus tore down the walls that divided us and built a new way for us to connect with God, we can begin to tear down the walls we built between each other, and we can work together to rebuild relationships that were damaged. We can do for others what God has done for us. Amen.